Good morning. Today we have the great opportunity to actually begin a second class, Winter Wonders class, at the same time as having the second session of our course, Critical Race Theory and the Politics of Teaching About Racism. Our guest this morning is Professor Kevin Brown, who was on the faculty of Indiana University Maurer Law School from 1987 to June 2022. But on July 1st, 2022, he joined the faculty of the University of South Carolina Law School as the Mitch Willoughby Distinguished Professor. He graduated in 1978 with distinction from the Indiana University Kelley School of Business, where he majored in accounting, and from Yale Law School in 1982. He was an original participant in the first Critical Race Theory workshop, which was held in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989. And he also attended 4 of the next 6 annual workshops. As a result of his participation in critical race theory, he developed the first course on race and law in any law school in the state of Indiana. For nearly 35 years, his primary interests have been in the area of race, law, and education, and the global impact of the African American struggle. Professor Brown has published 2 books, including Because of Our Success, The Changing Racial and Ethnic Ancestry of Blacks on Affirmative Action, and over 80 articles or comments on issues such as critical race theory, school desegregation, affirmative action, African American immersion schools, and school choice. A frequent speaker at scholarly conferences, Professor Brown has spoken on issues of race, education, diversity, or the global impact of African Americans over 300 times. And I particularly am happy that Professor Brown is speaking to us today. I've been working with him for a number of years on issues of caste discrimination in the US and internationally, and particularly the links between the Black American community in the US and those suffering caste discrimination overseas. So Professor Brown, could you take it away?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you a lot for that introduction, Rick. I'd certainly like to start by thanking my good friend Rick Gold for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And as he said, we've worked together for a number of years, and he heads an organization that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. So this is an opportunity for me to give something back to him for all his major service. Today, what I'm going to do is explain critical race theory. So my name is Kevin Brown. I was a law professor at Indiana University Maurer School of Law on the Bloomington campus for over 35 years. That is until June 30th, 2022. And then I joined the faculty here at the University of South Carolina Law School. And yes, I was one of the original participants of critical race theory. Let's see, there we go. When we first met in Wisconsin in the summer of 1989. So here's a picture of us, and I'm kind of the guy right there. I had a lot more hair back then, but that's what happens when you teach law students for 35 years, you lose it all. So yes, I was there with Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and Richard Delgado and Angela Harris and my law school professor, Harlan Dalton, as well as my law school classmate, Kendall Thomas. So there's Kimberly Crenshaw, there's Richard Delgado, there's Derek Bell, there's Angela Harris. Now I could talk about CRT defensively. After all, a number of state legislators are taking up anti-CRT bills, including the state of South Carolina, that at a minimum, these bills would prevent not just CRT, but diversity training in general in public schools. But I'm not going to present CRT defensively. I also want to make it clear that I am not going to be talking about how CRT is being presented by reactionary groups who seek to misconceptualize CRT in order to demonize it. These attacks on CRT are directed towards preventing or minimizing public school efforts to teach about racial history and racial oppression of the past in DEI training. It's part of an anti-democratic effort in our society that is attempting to attenuate the multiracial democracy that America is becoming and to obscure the continued racial inequality that exists in our society. CRT critics are literally attempting to whitewash America's history. But I will say one thing about the critics that I do want to respond to, and that is to address a criticism that is totally unfounded. One of the major criticisms against us as CRT harkens back to the era of Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare. They argue that we in CRT were communist or Marxist. Now, this has always seemed like a ludicrous criticism to make about law professors. After all, we teach the law. And while we teach courses and address race discrimination and wealth disparities, we also teach contracts and civil procedure and wills and trust in the Uniform Commercial Code. In other words, we are very much a part of upholding our socioeconomic order, not tearing it down. Thus, let me be clear, we did read Marxist and neo-Marxist writings, like we read the writings of other philosophers and political scientists, including John Locke, Adam Smith, John Rawls, Jeremy Bentham, Bell Hooks, Cornel West, Thomas Jefferson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and on and on. So we believe in America's economic system. Our goal as law professors who were CRT scholars was a more equitable distribution of the material resources of our society, not a tearing it down. To be clear, like so many Black intellectuals of the past, we felt that racial oppression is separate from the economic system. Thus, we didn't think that racism would disappear just because society moved to the workers' paradise. We felt that even if the Marxists could bring about their utopia, there would still be the issue of racial oppression to address. So I'm not going to be defensive about CRT. I'm going to talk to you about CRT as a person who was there in the room when we were debating these issues. Now, one of the famous early CRT articles was written by Mari Matsuda, and it was entitled Looking to the Bottom. In CRT, we realized that there was no neutral explanation of racial events, and what people understood always depended on their position in the racial socioeconomic hierarchy, as well as a person's experiences that they brought with them to the place where they were at. So in the spirit of CRT, I want to situate myself, and I'm not doing this to toot my own horn. I'm doing this to situate myself so you have a better understanding of the expertise I bring to the discussion. So in that regard, I'm a native of Indianapolis, Indiana, who attended segregated public schools all the way up to the 5th grade. I graduated from Indiana University Kelley School of Business in 1978 with a degree in accounting, and went on to graduate from Yale Law School in 1982 with my doctorate in jurisprudence. When I graduated from law school, I came back to my home city of Indianapolis, and I was the second attorney of color to work at a law firm of any significant size in the state of Indiana. When I joined the faculty of Indiana University Myers School of Law in 1987, I was the third person of color in a law school's 160-year history to join the faculty. When I retired, I was the longest serving law faculty member of color in the history of the state of Indiana. As I indicated, I did participate in the original critical race theory workshop in 1989. And as a result of that, in 1991, I created the first race and law course in any law school in the state of Indiana. Now, at age 66, I know I'm coming to the end of my active academic career. Thus, I look out from the perspective of an almost complete body of academic scholarship and law teaching. And in that reflection, I recognize that those CRT meetings, especially the first few, were the most significant academic experiences in my entire life. Those meetings molded the way that I have thought about race and racial subordination for over 35 years. But the other thing about being almost 3.5 decades removed from those first CRT meetings is that we can now see that what we were saying was correct. In other words, the passage of 35 years has proven us to be prophets, not fools. Now, let me start by defining critical race theory as a framework that helps us understand how race and racism continue to shape the meaning of racial inequality in our dominant culture, our concepts of equality laws, and our institutional government policies and practices. As a result of not understanding this, our society continues to generate the racial disparities visible in significant socioeconomic statistics, despite the reforms of the 1950s and 1960s. But I need to provide you, I'm going to elaborate on this definition, so don't feel like you need to understand everything right now. This is just an intro. But I need to provide you with a warning. I'm going to ask you to think about race, racism, and racial oppression in ways that our mainstream society normally does not. After all, CRT is a criticism of the normal way that we think about racial issues. The only way our society is going to overcome its persistent racial disparities is by changing the ways we think about race. Keep in mind, though, we were law professors. Our lessons were therefore primarily intended for law professors, judges, lawyers, and law students. In other words, the intended audience of our thinking were the individuals who are responsible for justice in our society. To make this point clear, I need to also say something about the importance of law. Law sets the limits of what individuals in our society can and cannot do. So the main point that we were making as CRT scholars is that the changes in law by our United States Supreme Court brought our nation's progress towards racial justice to a halt. Now, everyone now is familiar with the abortion debate, and all Americans are experiencing the reality with regard to the abortion issue, whether you are for or against a woman's right to choose or killing of innocent children. You now realize that whether abortion is right or not is dependent upon the predilection of justices of the US Supreme Court, who decide these issues for all of us based upon their interpretation of the law. Indeed, it's also likely that the Supreme Court will set off another wave of protest against its decisions this summer when it strikes down affirmative action. So when people speak of the system, what they're talking about is the legal system. This is the place where our society resolves all of its major issues. What it means then is that my job as a law professor isn't just to teach those who administer justice in our society, but it is also to try and influence the limits of the very system that people talk about when they talk about the system. Now, the original participants of CRT included Asian Americans like Neil Gotanda and Mari Matsuda, and of course, the formidable Latin scholar Richard Delgado, along with Trina Grillo. However, our thinking was dominated by the Black-white paradigm. 30 years removed from that original meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, we can look and see just how large the Latinx community has become in the US. But the concept of a Latinx community that existed in 1989 was still in a period of flux. Some of you are old enough to remember the time before there was a Latinx, Latino, or Hispanic community in the US. Back in the 1970s and before, we didn't so much have Latinos as we had Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Cubans. And even though the federal government had collected racial data for over 200 years, it wasn't until 1977 that the federal government adopted the definitions of racial and ethnic groups that created the concept of the Latinx community. But at any rate, with respect to CRT, in 1995, there was another movement that was sponsored among law professors known as LatCrit movement, and they deal primarily with issues impacting the Latinx community. So to understand CRT, and I mean truly understand CRT, you have to start where we were, and that is the racial disparities that existed in our society in 1989 when we met for the first time, and that still exist today. What I'm going to say next is very important to comprehend when understanding CRT. We were not worried about white racists motivated by racial animus of the 1960s, those who stood against desegregation and barred our entry into lunchroom counters, universities, and public schools. For the most part, in 1989, we felt that the legal structure in place could deal with this limited form of racial discrimination. What we worried about were the disparities in the important socioeconomic statistics. Now, I know that sometimes stats just seem like numbers, but I want you to think about the things that are important to people when thinking about the stats, because these are going to be things that will relate to their family, their job, and indeed whether or not they're unemployed, where they live, and whether or not they own their home, how much income they have, and that of course will include poverty concerns, how much wealth they have. This is critical because the more wealth you have, the more money you have for your children to give them a head start in life. People will be concerned about their political power, their educational credentials. People will be concerned about the possibilities of being sucked into the criminal justice system. And of course, they will be concerned about access to medical care and certainly life expectancy. So while stats are stats, when you look at the racial disparities in these stats, you quickly realize that people of color, especially Black people, are having very different lived experiences that are shaped by our country's discriminatory past. The statistics reveal that Black people are struggling more economically. We don't have the money for vacations in Europe or tutors for SAT prep courses. We don't have money to pass on to our children to give them a head start in life. We know family and friends who are incarcerated or who have had negative experiences with the criminal justice system. We see people's lives end much sooner, and we stand by dumbfounded as we hear white politicians look us in the eye and say that CRT education hurts their children and makes their children feel bad because they are expressing an obvious obliviousness to the suffering of our children that we are enduring in those very educational institutions. Simply put, CRT was primarily concerned about the normalization of our racial disparities in the important socioeconomic conditions of our society. That was the primary motivation for our work. Now, a second caveat for you is that I must talk about history. I know that the basis of American culture is individual self-determination. You determine who you are going to be. It's through your efforts that you become who you are. And we preach this as a society. We teach this in our schools. We sing about it in our songs. But this focus on individual self-determination carries with it a very significant blind spot. Because if you are the one who is responsible for you becoming who you are, what does history have to do with you? The dominant culture in our society, therefore, by definition, discounts the importance of history. But in CRT, we understood that while self-determination is important on an individual level, much of what will happen in a society relates to the history of that society, not the self-determination of its members. After all, the reason I was the second person of color to work at an Indianapolis office of a national accounting firm that I joined in 1978, and the second person of color as an attorney at a law firm of any significant size in the state of Indiana, and the third person of color to teach at Indiana University Meyer School of Law in 1987, and the one who created the first race and law course in the state of Indiana in 1991, has everything to do with history, not with the individual efforts of Black people. So we in CRT recognize that while self-determination is important, we are also products of the history of our society. Hence, CRT stresses the history of racial oppression. So to understand where we were when we came together in 1989, the place to start are the socioeconomic conditions of the Black community in the 1980s. As we get to the 1989, one thing we know is the progress towards school desegregation had peaked in 1981. With all the efforts of American society at the zenith, only 37.1% of Black students ever attended majority white schools. The schools by 1989 were in the process of resegregating. And of course, school desegregation was one of our major programs to attack racial discrimination. The number of Black males in prison increased by a staggering 275% in the 1980s. This is the Reagan administration's war on crime and the spreading of crack cocaine through Black neighborhoods. The homicide rate for young Black males more than doubled in the 1980s. And with respect to Black males, in 1976, 45.5% of Black college students were males. By the time we get to 1990, that percentage has dropped to 36.7%. Indeed, since the 90s, Black women have received 2/3 of the college degrees awarded to Blacks in this country. Black family income stood at 63% of white family income, down slightly from where it was in 1960. Black poverty rate remained at about 30%, which was 3.5 times the ratio of white poverty, and was about the same as it was in 1960. And there was a slight closing of the racial gap of Blacks with college degrees, but that ratio still stood at 2-to-1. And while Nancy Reagan was telling us, just say no to drugs, Senator John Kerry testified about CIA involvement in crack cocaine winding up in Black neighborhoods. But as bad as things looked in 1989, the 90s looked like they were going to get even worse. The federal courts were terminating school desegregation decrees. In 1984, Ronald Reagan had gotten elected as president for the second time and received 2/3 of the white vote, but 9% of the Black vote. In 1988, his vice president, George Bush, received 60% of the white vote and 11% of the Black vote. What that meant then was that the federal government was going to continue to be hostile to the issues and the concerns of the Black community. And Black conservatives were criticizing affirmative action and talking about the significance of race. This is something that seemed perfectly ludicrous to us as the only law professor, one of two law professors of color at our predominantly white law schools. Commentators were arguing that Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. would have opposed affirmative action because they went to his I Dream speech and they pulled out of it his statement that he wanted to see his 4 daughters judged by the content of their character, not the color of the skin. Therefore, King would have disagreed with affirmative action. And for us as law professors, the United States Supreme Court took center stage. In 1989, the court delivered 5 major civil rights opinions, all cutting back on rights of underrepresented minorities. The most significant of the Supreme Court's opinion in 1989 was one that raised serious issues about the constitutionality of affirmative action. And the attacks on affirmative action were the most disconcerting ones for us in CRT. Indeed, it was the attacks on affirmative action that represented an existential threat to us as law professors of color. The 23 of us who met, as I said before, were all law professors of color at predominantly white schools. And for many of us, we were either the only professor of color or one of 2 on our faculty. Ending affirmative action then would mean that we could not look forward to many more people of color joining our faculties, and it would be devastating for Black law students. An estimate that was done in 1991 concluded that without affirmative action, 2/3 of the Black law students in law schools would not be admitted to a single law school that they applied to. And once again, Black conservatives were discussing the declining significance of race. Now, everything I've talked about up to this point is really a setup for what CRT is. But you can see we were highly motivated to find out what had gone wrong with the march towards racial equality. However, to look at the road to racial equality, we need to go further back from 1989, all the way back to the beginnings of the civil rights struggle. As most Americans understand, the civil rights era began in 1954 with the US Supreme Court's decision to strike down racial segregation in public schools in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. This is the Supreme Court case that struck down segregation statutes that covered 40% of America's public school students. In Brown, the Supreme Court faced the question for the first time, what was wrong with segregation when the tangible resources in the Black and white schools were equal? In other words, what is wrong with true separate but equal? Now, while it might seem obvious to us today that segregation was wrong, this was not the case in 1954. Thus, the court had to determine the harm of segregation, even when the tangible and material resources were equal. But to be fair to the court, let us journey back to 1954 and look at the conditions that existed when the court rendered its opinion. Because in 1954, people of African descent were called Negroes or colored out of respect. And we were called coon, darky, or even Black as an insult. Neither America nor her descendants from Africa had undergone the civil rights movement, the Black consciousness movement, the multicultural movement, the diversity movement, nor the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement. The court's opinion in Brown versus Board of Education preceded by a decade the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the most sweeping piece of civil rights legislation in our country's history. It also preceded by 11 years the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And at the time of the court's opinion in 1954, most Negroes in the South had been disenfranchised for the entire 20th century. And indeed, it was the South where most Black people lived. Discrimination based on race in employment, merchandising stores, eating establishment, places of entertainment, hotels and motels were generally accepted facts of life. Negroes seldom occupied positions above the most menial levels in American businesses and corporations. Even lower level management positions were, for the most part, unobtainable. What would become known as the glass ceiling of the 1980s was a firmly implanted outright concrete barrier in the 1950s. The Supreme Court's opinion in Brown versus Board of Education has a mythical standing in our society's pantheon of racial equality. While striking down racial segregation was a tremendous step forward for American society on the road of racial equality, indeed a giant leap, if you want to put it that way. However, as we think about the court's opinion, we must keep in mind that the justices who rendered that opinion were products of their time. All of them were white men who were born in the 1800s. And if you read the court's opinion in Brown versus Board of Education from the cold reality that we are now 70 years removed from that opinion, you can see that that opinion could best be understood as moving America down the road of racial equality. It could not get us there. More was definitely going to be needed. In Brown, as I said, the court faced the question, what is wrong with segregation when the tangible resources of the Black and white schools are equal? And here is where the limit to the court's opinion manifests itself. Let me now then take you to the wording of the court when it said the problem with segregation and it announced what it was. These are from the court's opinion itself. What's wrong with segregation? To separate African-American youth from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect upon the colored children, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law therefore has a tendency to retard the educational and mental development of the Negro children. A closer examination of these statements reveals some rather startling realities. First, the court states that this impact of segregation on the mental development only affected the Negro children. Second, that this form of retardation affects the hearts and minds in ways unlikely ever to be undone, meaning Black adults who'd already gone through this segregated school system were hopelessly negatively impacted. And third, the solution to the problem is to move Black children into spaces with whites. Now, what made Brown such a historic break with the racial attitudes of the past is not that it viewed Black people as equal. It is that it perceived that the reason Blacks were inferior related to a deficit social environment of Blacks or our deficit culture. Comparatively speaking, this rationale was more positive than earlier rationales because those earlier rationales viewed the source of Black inferiority as something endemic to our biology or as a curse from the Almighty himself. These sources of inequality, if accepted, mean that society is powerless to change. But by saying it's social environment and cultural factors, society can at least do something about it. But here's where the problem of race in America today is revealed. The court's opinion basically ignores the corrupting impact of the history of slavery and segregation had on the racial beliefs of our entire society and those of whites. If Black people were made to feel inferior, clearly whites too would have suffered a psychological impact of false feelings of superiority. The court's opinion also ignores the fact that our educational institutions, as well as all of our other institutions, would have been corrupted by the racial beliefs that segregation taught. For example, when you think about public education, the decisions to determine what materials to teach, how to teach them, who should teach them, how all of this should be administered, would have all been based upon the corrupting beliefs of racial inferiority about Black people. Yet the court's opinion ignores these impacts of segregation. It is also important to note that the social scientists who filed a brief with the US Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education did point out the impact of segregation on Black students as well as white students. And this is what the psychologist of the day said about the impact of segregation on whites. The children of the majority group who learn the prejudices of our society often develop patterns of guilt feelings, rationalizations, and other mechanisms which they must use in an attempt to protect themselves from recognizing the essential injustice of their unrealistic fears and hatred. Now, I want to stress the need to produce rationalizations and other mechanisms to protect themselves from recognizing the essential injustice done to Black people, because those rationalizations are still going on today. When thinking of rationalizations, just think about how standardized tests function in our society. All standardized tests, let me say that one again, all standardized tests, whether it's the SAT, the ACT, the LSAT, the MCAT, the GMAT, the GRE, the OAT, the DAT, all of them have substantial racial disparities. And the assumption is that these tests are fine as they are written, and that the poor performance of Black kids on them is to be expected. But let me provide an alternative explanation of these tests, one that was given by a justice of the US Supreme Court. In 1974, Justice William Douglas has the distinction of being the first Supreme Court justice to write an opinion addressing affirmative action. In a case dealing with affirmative action program from the University of Washington Law School, Douglas focused his attention on the LSAT. This is a test which we use today even to determine admissions to the nation's law schools. And what Justice Douglas said was, since the LSAT reflects questions touching on cultural backgrounds, the admissions committee acted properly, in my view, in setting minority applications apart for separate processing. These minorities have cultural backgrounds that are vastly different from the dominant Caucasian. A test sensitively tuned for most applicants would be wide of the mark for many minorities. Thus, despite the huge step forward that we get from Brown versus Board of Education striking down segregation statutes, that opinion had a huge limitation, that it meant it could not deliver America to the promised land of racial equality. So when we look at the limitations of how American society began the school desegregation era, the court assumed that the harm of segregation was what it did to Blacks. Segregation, however, also negatively impacted whites, as Justice Douglas would say in that same opinion. The years of slavery did more than retard the progress of Blacks. Even a greater wrong was done to whites by creating arrogance instead of humility, and by encouraging the growth of the fiction of a superior race. The beliefs of segregation also impacted dominant American culture in our public and private institutions. But thus this rationale of Brown stunted the possibilities of the desegregation era, because it converted the programs that took account of race into social welfare programs for a group of disadvantaged people, as opposed to social justice programs recognizing a great societal obligation to right a great historical wrong. In addition, even today, the court's rationale in Brown provides the common explanation for the ubiquitous racial disparities that we know in so many socioeconomic factors. That is, when we look at racial disparities in the socioeconomic statistics, most people blame Black people because we have an urban culture, a culture that delays gratification, a hip hop culture, a culture of of victimization, and of course, predominantly Black spaces are presumed to be less rigorous and less meritorious. By the 1970s, however, this rationale was waning, especially in law. The US Supreme Court was increasingly embracing colorblindness. It was the understanding by us in CRT of what colorblindness meant that was our most fundamental breakthrough. The colorblind era argued that the proper way to deal with racial and ethnic differences is to transcend them and to deal with people as individuals. Colorblindness is tied to a certain understanding of individualism. It is not the only understanding of individualism, but it is the one that has become dominant within our legal system and still is. Colorblindness is tied to a view of the individual that privileges self-determination. The notion is that deep inside of you is your true self. That you can see how this idea is derived from the concept of the soul in Christianity. What you are supposed to do in your life, therefore, is to discover your true self, and then to line up the aspects of your life out here so that it's consistent with your true self. Since the goal is to do what your true self believes you should do, the major obstacle to self-determination would include being constrained in what you believe you should do based upon characteristics that you do not choose. In other words, involuntary characteristics like race, ethnicity, gender, physical disabilities, sexual orientation need to be ignored so that they do not constrain individual self-determination. Colorblindness then says that the way to deal with racial and ethnic differences is to transcend those differences, to treat people as individuals. Now, let me be clear. There's nothing wrong with this when you're dealing with two people who are getting to know each other. Indeed, it seems to me the only place you can start in getting to know another individual is with a notion of colorblindness to try to get to know them as an individual. And under colorblindness, you can have and will have successful Black individuals. Indeed, this is one of the things that we've seen. So it is possible to have a Barack Obama, an Oprah Winfrey, a Colin Powell, a Williams Sisters, a Kamala Harris, a LeBron James. But when you apply color blindness to resolve legal, educational, economic, political, and social issues, then it has a completely different impact. From the perspective of Blacks as a group, color blindness has a number of major problems. First, color blindness denies the lived experiences of people of color that are shaped by race. Right? This was the whole point of talking about how I'm breaking color barriers. If you would transcend my color, then my breaking of barriers means nothing. Second, color blindness provides a narrow definition of racism. Because individuals' actions are controlled by their conscious intent, racism only occurs when a person's actions are motivated by racial consideration. But there are other forms of racism: unconscious racism, stereotyping, institutional or cultural racism, all of which are overlooked. Color consciousness of people of color under color blindness becomes viewed as racism. I can't begin to count the number of times I've heard people say, why do you have Black student unions? Why do you have Black attorneys groups? Why do you have Black law professor groups? Thus, our color consciousness is assumed to be a form of racism itself. And of course, because there's a moral condemnation to being called a racist, individuals object mightily to being called racist. Color blindness discounts the impact of history on the present. Thus, it minimizes the explanation for the current socioeconomic disparities being rooted in the history of America's history of racial discrimination. And instead, it means that people stigmatize minority people as failures because the history of racial oppression is underappreciated. Color blindness institutionalizes the experiences of the majority as the norm, and thereby providing them with an incredible advantage. This is the point that Justice Douglas was making about the LSAT. And then finally, taking race into account to remedy the present effects of our discriminatory past becomes a new form of racism. And this results in freezing in place the existing racial socioeconomic disparities. So let me now go quickly through some of the racial disparities in the important socioeconomic statistics. And what I'm trying to do is show you how little change has occurred in these statistics over the last 60 years. Here's median family income. All of these statistics are in the article, which I sent out, which hopefully you have, so you can see them there. Here's median family income. Here's the percentage, and you can see since 1960, it's been between 62 and 64%. Here's poverty rates. And another way to look at poverty rates, here's the ratio. Pretty consistent. Here's percentages of persons with college degrees over the age of 25. And you can see how as more Americans get college, the racial and ethnic gaps remain. There's another way to look at it in terms of the ratios, which gets smaller simply because the percentage of college graduates gets larger. Here's unemployment by race. And once again, here's the proportionate statistics. Here's home ownership. And here's another one that breaks down home ownership so you can see how stable Black home ownership has been over the last 60 years. And then here's life expectancy. And here's it in another way where you can see now it is a little better today than it's been historically, but not a whole lot, but it is better. And then here's their incarceration rates where you could see how they jumped so significantly in the 1980s, which was one of the points I was trying to make. And then finally, here's family wealth. Thus, I hope you can see that colorblind interpretations of the law have frozen into place our legal disparities. But now, having done all of this, it should be relatively simple for me then to show you the major arguments of critical race theory. One, critical race theory argues that American society has normalized the racial disparities of people of color, especially Blacks. That these racial disparities result from our society's discriminatory past, which are being perpetuated. That our society needs a race consciousness motivated by a desire to dismantle institutional policies and practice that reproduce the racial disparities, not the older race consciousness directed at furthering the oppression of people of color. That there should be a difference made between policies and programs that use race to attack racial disparities from policies and programs that are intended to perpetuate racial disparities. So the CRT concepts, interest convergence, this comes from Harvard Law professor Derek Bell. This is probably the one that he's most known for. Interest convergence argues that Black people only move forward when our interest converges with that of elite whites. And if that's the case, then racial realism follows, which is racial subordination is permanent in American society. White privilege. When you look at the socioeconomic racial differences, you can see the advantages that whites have. We attack white innocence. White innocence comes from individualism, where individualism says, hey, I'm not responsible for what other people done in the past. But our argument about the racial disparities is we're not talking about individual differences, we're talking about group differences. So individualism does not really play in our understanding of how to attack the differences. And then of course, the other problems that CRT focuses on are other forms of racial discrimination and racism other than conscious racism, such as unconscious racism, stereotypes, and microaggressions, and institutional racism. And as you can see, we use the term minoritized people as opposed to minorities to demonstrate how we were made minorities in our society. There, of course, is also a need for racially conscious remedies to attack the continuing racial disparities. And then finally, we do emphasize the discussion of history. So with that, I think I want to stop and probably went a little further than I expected, but hopefully there's a little time for questions. Yeah, I can hang around longer, but let me stop there and give you a chance. So maybe turn it back over to Rick.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown, Kevin. And thanks to all of our audience and recognizing the power of your presentation. We're open to discussions, questions, comments, both online and here at OCAMIC. If anybody would like to raise any points. Okay, the question was, what do you suggest should be done?
Yeah, once again, if I ignore what the United States Supreme Court seems to be, what would first have to be done, quite frankly, is a change in the US Supreme Court. Since the early since when Richard Nixon got elected in 1968, he came in and made 4 appointments to the Supreme Court in his first term. So he turned the direction of the court away from opinions that protected the rights of minorities to increasingly opinions that attacked them. So to a certain extent, the problem is not the political process. The problem are the courts. If the politicians say we want to do this, to attack the racial disparities. It's the courts who say they can't do it. So the only way to get us out of this mess, quite frankly, is voting for the people who will put different people on the Supreme Court. The problem we're dealing with right now is we're looking at the most conservative Supreme Court since at least the 1950s. There are colleagues of mine who would argue it's the most conservative since the 1940s. But the problem is, I can give reasons and suggestions, which would be policies and programs that take account of race to attack the racial disparities, but those policies and programs would be struck down by the courts. So the first thing has to be to change the members of the court.
Thank you. We have a question here from one of our Zoom participants. Keith, go ahead.
Yes. Many thoughts about what you spoke about today. I really appreciate yours coming and talking with us. I was struck simply because it was early in your talk about the comments on segregation, the problems with standardized testing. And I wonder if you thought, is it ever possible, not likely, but is it possible to ever come up with any standardized test in any field which would not have a racial or ethnic bias?
Short answer would be probably not. Long answer, if you follow what I'm really saying from us as critical race theorists who were law professors, the problem we see is in the law itself. It's the law that needs to be changed. Well, if you're going to have a law school, you can't really educate the kids for the law that you want to be the law. You have to educate them for the law that exists. So if you're going to now use a test to determine who gets into law school, the test you're going to use is a test that's going to talk about how well will they do given the way the law currently exists. So the mechanism to determine whether or not people will do well in law school will be built upon the way the legal system currently exists, which is built back into your education, which therefore gets built back into the test.
Why couldn't you do that?
Why
couldn't you then generate a test that had reflected that approach?
If we generated a test that was one where there would be no racial disparity, it is likely that test is not going to be predictive of how well they do in law school. And then you have a problem of what's the purpose of the test if the test doesn't have a close relationship to the teaching in law, which gets me back to my short answer, which you asked me, is it possible? And I tend to think probably not. But just as a footnote on this, I have a whole separate discussion that I have on standardized tests. And one of them is really just the way you select questions to put on a standardized test, right? If you're going to put a question on a standardized test, the question you're going to have to put on there has to be valid, which means people who do well on your test have to do well on the question, and people who do poorly on your test have to do poorly on the question. Well, when you have a question that Black kids do better than white kids, and there are those questions, that is evidence that the question is invalid and therefore will never show up on the test. So overcoming the gaps is virtually impossible.
Thank you. Do we have a question here in the Oak Room? Alice, did you have a question?
Okay, she will.
Mr. Brown, thank you so much for your talk today. It was very important, and it ties in with what we're seeing happening here in Florida. And our legal system in Florida, not legal, I shouldn't say that, administration in Florida is now even attacking the school boards. And I can see nothing but disaster ahead. So I appreciate your talk today, and you're right, voting is the main thing. it really hasn't changed much from the 1950s.
I will say this about Florida. When I did decide to leave Indiana, it was because I got a call the 1st of March from the University of Florida Law School. And they said, look, we have a seminar on race and law. Would you be interested in coming down and running it? And that was really the first time I really thought about leaving Indiana. And I said, yes, I'll be interested. I'll put my name in the running. Then 2 days later, the university, I deliver pretty much the same critical race theory lecture at the University of South Carolina Law School. And there, the dean of the law school says, you should come and join us. Don't retire, come and join us. So I had the opportunity to join Florida's law school faculty, but I made my decision to pull out of the Florida running on April 22nd, which was the day that DeSantis signed the anti-woke law. Indeed, I can tell you tomorrow, I will be working on the legal arguments to strike down Florida's anti-woke law, because there's some serious legal issues with these anti-CRT legislation. But you're right, it certainly sends a signal, and it sent a signal to me because I could imagine myself as the original critical race theorist teaching at the University of Florida Law School with DeSantis saying, I'm going to make critical race theory or anti-critical race theory a platform in my running for the presidency. What about that Kevin Brown guy over there? So that's exactly why I'm not in Florida right now.
Too bad for us. Ophelia, go ahead.
Yes, it really strikes to my question, but first I want to thank you for your excellent talk, which clarifies the concepts, the situation, the history, very, very well. Thank you. My concern was, and we're just talking about this, a lot of times this discussion of critical theory is interpreted as applying to children or schools or education, but I want to make a point that it actually is an intent to deprive law schools of being able to research and teach this theory, or to have faculty in these, a significant number of faculty engaged with all kinds of progressive legal scholarship. And the reason this idea came to my mind is that I'm also, among other things, Latin American studies scholar. And at one of the congresses I attended a few years ago, one excellent talk from, I think it was a faculty member at one of the law schools in Chile. And they may have been, well, it was one of the major universities in Chile. I don't want to mistake and not name one. But he said, he declared, I am now the only progressive legal theorist in this law school faculty, because over the years they have turned the law school away from any kind of progressive interpretation, for example, of human rights. And now the only version of human rights that is being able to be taught here is the human rights that supports whatever, some sort of right-wing version of what rights are. So I want to share this with you because it's a real concern to me, having retired in Florida and having taught in Florida my entire life, not in a law school, but in liberal arts, that this may be happening in the intent that the executive of the government is sort of creating a climate for this type of knowledge not to be able to be researched and reproduced.
I think your point is an excellent point. I didn't realize before I became a faculty member that our colleges and universities are the places that generate the knowledge. Right? We're talking about a debate about critical race theory that really sort of gets started full tilt a couple of years ago. But we were talking about CRT 33 years ago. It took time for our understanding to filter down into our society. But that's what happens is academics produce new knowledge, it's got to get out of the academia into the rest of the society, and that takes a period of time. So if you can control who's in your colleges and universities, you can control the thoughts that are going to eventually come out into the society. And that is a huge danger, and I agree with you.
Thank you. We have a question here in the Oak Room.
Professor Brown, thank you so much for a very elucidating lecture. I, of course, as an almost 80-year-old, I am well aware of the changes in American society. And I have to say that there has been a certain degree of parallel between Black minority experiences and those of women. So I'm very sensitive to that whole issue of discrimination. However, my question is, I am confounded by the number of conservative, right-wing Black politicians and judges, pointing specifically to Clarence Thomas, whose decisions are appalling. He is a racist. How does this man deal with himself? Can you explain this explosion of Black conservatives? Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. So there's two things. I'll first explain the explosion of Black conservatives, and then I'll come back to Clarence Thomas. One of the things, this did not actually come out in my background, but I have spent a significant amount of time, or had spent a significant amount of time in South Africa. In South Africa, I am a Black immigrant in a society with a history of racial discrimination. So when I'm in South Africa, I understand that the Black South Africans are suffering from discrimination, but it's not discrimination of my people. So I don't have the same concern about the discrimination that South Africans face that I do of African Americans. One of the really little understood phenomena that has been going on in the US in the that started about 1968, when we changed our immigration law, was the influx of Black immigrants. And in the 1980s, so the 1970s was mostly Caribbeans, 1980s mostly African. But America now is looking at a situation where something like 10% of the Black people are foreign born. If you grow up in Jamaica, if you grow up in Ghana, if you grow up in Nigeria, your experience of race is totally different from the way it is here. You don't think about race. You don't run into race discrimination. It's not part of your consciousness. So when they come to the US, they find themselves battling this race discrimination that they knew nothing about, that they don't understand themselves. And therefore they tend to take on attitudes that don't really reflect the history of America's racial discrimination. So they're less likely to fight against it, right? If I'm from Nigeria or Ghana or even Jamaica, my concern are for the Black people back home, not the ones here. This is not my fight. So part of what you're seeing by the number of Black conservatives is a significant number of them are going to be Black immigrants, first or second generation. The other issue that we've been running into, and this is one that astonished me on standardized tests, is the explosion in the number of Black multiracials, right? Children that are half Black, half white. Certainly a positive development in our society, absolutely no question about it at all. But I did a study where when you looked at the standardized test scores of Black, white multiracials, their standardized test scores are pretty comparable to white test scores. In other words, there wasn't the racial gap in the Black, white multiracials that took the law school admissions test that you see with single race Blacks, because they're coming from a different culture, different understanding about race, a different indoctrination. So I think part of what you're seeing is the change in the racial and ethnic ancestry of Blacks. And as I said, this is one of the areas And actually, Rick mentioned my book, Because of Our Success, the Changing Racial and Ethnic Ancestry of Blacks on Affirmative Action, that is having a really not understood impact, because it's not the traditional African Americans who history is rooted in slavery and segregation that are doing well in American society. It tends more and more to be Black multiracials and Black immigrants.
Thank you. Roy, go ahead.
I have a very brief comment, which was inspired by something you said. I came to teach at the law school here in 1962, directly from the Yale Law School.
Oh, okay.
And I guess it was about 1970 when the second state law school opened at Florida State University. And I recall an editorial that appeared in most of Florida's papers. And it apparently was authored by a state Supreme Court justice from Sopchoppy, who said, finally, we have a law school that's going to teach what the law is rather than what it ought to be, as they do at the University of Florida.
Well, yeah, I'd have to say, at least from our standpoint, both Indiana and both here in South Carolina, we have to be worried about bar passage rates. I mean, we just simply cannot ignore bar passage rates, meaning we have to teach what the law is, because if we're not teaching what the law is, our students aren't going to do well on the bar. And if they don't do well on the bar, believe me, we will get the criticisms coming. South Carolina, where I'm at right now, had a very dismal performance on the South Carolina bar exam this past year. And we're full tilt into a committee looking at how do we improve the teaching on the bar exam. And of course, one of the major things we're sitting there talking about is the students need to take more bar related courses. I think, generally speaking, probably 2/3 of the law school curriculum is going to be bar related kind of courses. You might, if you're a student, have a chance to take 3 or 4 courses on race and law, feminist jurisprudence, law and development, the kind of real welfare law, the kind of really social courses. But believe me, my law school colleagues are very focused on teaching the law as it is. I doubt that many of them would say, hey, we agree with everything Kevin's just said. I think most of them would go, wow, I didn't realize he was so critical of traditional legal thinking.
Dr. Brown, I know we're over our time. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, Holly, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation to us today. You helped a lot in me reading and trying to understand what's going on here in Florida. I'm a result prior to all my degrees, but in public education in Florida when we had a good system. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit. I like the fact that you brought up what the segregated system was like, because I went all the way through undergraduate school. My undergrad was FSU, but I went all the way through there. And if you wanted to see a Black or brown individual, then you sneaked into the A&M football games. But I am so concerned. I've had many careers, but one of them was the military. I spent 26 years, and a lot of people that haven't been there and only see snippets don't understand the racial disparities that happen in the military. And what our governor has done, which you're probably familiar with, has decided with our teacher shortage that, and I just found out the details the other day, there's not enough applications, but he has provided through the legislature a prior military of 4 years of service, doesn't matter what branch you were in, 4 years of service, and 60 college credits, doesn't matter what they're in, to then teach. So when you talk about the issues, which I've seen right here in Alachua County, mentoring a student in the Take Stock program for 5 years, a Black student, that how are we going to assure that our young people in our state assuming that numbers of these people will be hired, they know nothing about any of the methodology of teaching. So the good news might be that we might have a teacher of the color of the student and the culture of the students, but don't know how to teach, and how can that be helpful? It could be a negative thing, but I wonder if you could just briefly respond to what your thoughts on that might be, or what we might be able to do about it other than vote. And that may be the only.
Yeah, so I'll do this briefly, but I really sort of came into law teaching to understand education issues. That was the area I spent most of my time for the first 20 years. And what really has amazed me has been the embrace of charter schools and vouchers, because we have been working on educational reform literally since the 1960s. I mean, this is one of the things that always strikes me when people say, well, you don't need affirmative action fixed K through 12. Like, that's never occurred to anyone in the United States before. We've been working on this for 60 years. And I'd say the first charter school was created in the 1990s. And I've seen those spread. And charter schools, as well as vouchers that you take to private schools, are part of a theory behind education that says, look, we can't figure this out, so let's bring market principles to bear. Let's have the schools compete, and then somehow through the market, we'll figure out the good ones and we'll figure out the bad ones. So the sense I get is that the dominant thrust of educational reform is to let parents make choices about their schools that their kids go to. And all the studies do show, they don't show that charter schools do better than public schools. What they show is that the parents like them better, that the parents prefer the choice. And for the politicians, it shows charter schools are cheaper. So you can reduce the amount of money you spend on education and make the parents happier. And because the parents are happier, you can make the political argument that choice is better than going to public school. And I'm kind of with you. I'm looking at this going, well, all you're doing now is taking the advantages of people who have more wherewithal, who are going to select the better charter schools for their kids to go to. And then the other parents who don't know as much are going to pick the worst schools. But instead of saying now the problem is public education, now we say the problem is the parents making the wrong choices. And that would undercut the need for us as a society to say we need to do something about this. So I am with you. I am very, very concerned, but I don't see the drift going any other way, because it seems to me like state governments that are trying to cut taxes. And if you're trying to cut taxes, for most states, half of their tax budget's going to go to K through 12 education. So that's the only place you can cut. So I'm with you. I'm very concerned. I probably would come back to voting. Yeah. Well, let me stop there, because
Well, and the money is attached to the voucher, so it leaves the public school system and goes to the charter.
right, exactly. Which makes it, from the standpoint of the public schools, they can't be innovative because they got to figure out, how do we reduce our budgets? How do we cut costs? So the notion of how you come up with better teaching programs has to take second fiddle to, how do we reduce our budget another 3-4% this year? How do we do it next year? I understand the problem. I mean, I don't want to be overly pessimistic about this, but it's because I understand the problem that for the last 10 to 15 years, I've really stayed away from education issues, because I see the drift of it is in such a way that there's very little that you're going to be able to do without a fundamental change in the way Americans think about public education. And that doesn't seem to be the direction we're going. We seem to be going in the direction of more privatization of public schools, more choice through charter schools, which is another form of privatization, not trying to improve the public schools, which would cost money because you would need to pay to get better teachers.
Thank you. Rick Gold, final thoughts?
Thanks again so much for the presentation. Really, really affecting. I had a question about the implications of the CRT movement on mass movements. Yesterday, we had a lecture by Professor Paul Ortiz, a history professor here at University of Florida, and he brought up the fact that CRT movement has had a tremendous impact on the popular imagination and the way it affects education at universities and in public schools. The question that I have basically is, what do the founders of the movement think about keeping it restricted within the legal community, or its implications for changes in the organization and the movements of popular, of people to change consciousness?
That is an excellent question. To be honest with you, we never thought about this outside of anything other than the legal field. Now, it did start to take off in education. So, and I was probably the scholar who did the most work on K through 12 education. So I became aware of critical race theory in education probably 10 years after we got started. And it was clear to me they were doing something slightly different than what we were doing. I would say, so for us, I will say this: we did understand that legal opinions have to reflect and respect dominant American beliefs. That you can't fundamentally change the legal system's treatment of race without also a change in how Americans think about race. So by implication, there was a notion that what we were doing had to be broader than within law. But at the same time, don't get me wrong, we were always dealing, so since 1976, the Supreme Court split on conservatives with respect to law and liberals with respect to law was 5-4. And it has been 5-4 all the way up until when Justice Ginsburg unexpectedly passed away and Amy Coney Barrett took that spot. Now it's 6-3. So our focus was always, man, if we could just change one justice, we can fundamentally rewrite race law, and that will open up the umbrella for society to do much more with respect to race. So I would say our overwhelming focus, without question, for us was in law, wasn't outside of law. But I can say that while it wasn't something that we consciously thought about, we did realize there is a relationship between the two. Now, if I were just having a conversation specifically about critical race theory in education and what I would stress in education, it would primarily be about American history. Right, you know, I teach a race and law course, so I know what I would stress. And there's a couple of points. I would talk much more about the history of racial discrimination in the US, because in some ways it's a mistake to think of it only as Black and white. I mean, you go through the 1920s with our immigration law that shut off immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. And at the same time was the eugenics movement. So we were sterilizing women we didn't think were worthy of having children, as well as our interactions in Latin America. And then when the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba became ours as part of the Spanish-American War, you see this tremendous spread of racism throughout the globe. It wasn't just Black and white. So understanding just how deeply that concept had become in American society, and to a certain extent, the world, would be something important. But, and this will probably be the last point I'll end up making, I would stress the Civil War. it really is kind of striking when I look at all images of the Civil War, how few Black soldiers I see. Yet when you look at the Civil War, 85% of eligible Black males in the North fought for the Union. By the end of that war, 13% of the Union Army and 25% of the Union Navy were Black troops. Even though Black troops didn't fight in 1861, 1862, they nevertheless are 10% of the Union's war casualties. Both Lincoln and Grant will say, without the Black troops, we could not have won the war. And when you look at the things that Grant did to protect the rights of Black people, and right when he became president, and no one would know more about the significance of the Black troops in saving the Union than Grant. There's no president who did more to advance the rights of Blacks than Grant, with maybe arguably Lyndon Johnson. And I would point to that because to a real extent, the reason America is today is because of those Black troops in the Civil War. And that's when we passed 3 amendments to the Constitution to protect the rights of Blacks, 5 major civil rights bills. All of that was in payment for the realization, had these people not stepped up, our country would have split in 2.
We can't thank you enough for your time. Definitely a treasure to this series this semester, and we appreciate all you do. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.